LGBTQ Leaders Conference. Thank you to our presenting sponsors, Amazon, Coca-Cola, Meta, and Toyota. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, Chief Technology Correspondent at Axios, Ina Fried, and our panelists, U.S. Congressman Evan Lowe, Howl Media co-founder Ryan Brack, and AFL-CIO Technology Institute Executive Director Amanda Ballantyne to the stage.
Well, welcome everyone. The good news is in a year or two, you'll be able to party all night and just send your avatar to attend the morning keynote. But I appreciate the fact that y'all are here in person. When I was talking just about everywhere I go, like this is the topic that everyone's talking about because it has so many impacts. It's going to change the way people run for office. It's going to change not just how do you regulate AI, but AI is going to change all the other things around governing. So I'm really excited for this conversation. We have a great wealth of experience on the stage, and I thought maybe to get things started, it'd be helpful if each of you just kind of gave a little bit of a sense of how you're coming at this discussion. So introduce yourself, but in the context of how does that position you as you are thinking about AI, because you each have such uniquely different but valuable experiences that you come at this discussion with. Ryan, maybe we'll start with you. You have the experience on the inside of seeing how Google and Meta approach these, but also working with companies and others to kind of figure out how do we incorporate this into our lives.
Yeah, I mean, what a frontier conversation. So happy to have the Victory Institute support and sponsor this, and obviously thank you for all that you're doing to cover AI. I come at AI from a communications background, working both in-house for agencies and with technology companies. So I spent a couple of years at Meta working on their generative AI public affairs team, over at Google a decade ago, helping to push out a lot of their social media technologies, and then with clients like Samsung and Amazon Alexa. So really being on the inside of frontier technologies as they're pushing them out, but also with the eye on how society accepts or understands them. I'm really focused right now on the future of AI around digital privacy and transparency education. There's a lot of speculation in the category, a lot of fear, uncertainty, and dread, but there's also, I think, a silver lining in that we are having conversations, that there are communities now that are being tapped in. There's a lot more public-private partnership in this round of innovation with AI than there had been previously, and so that gives me a little bit of hope. That's what I'm focused on right now.
And Evan, obviously you bring the experience of the district you represent, my hometown, the Bay Area, obviously where a lot of this is being developed, but it's affecting everything from, again, how you run to how you operate to changing the tenor of all the types of legislation. And I'm curious, what are you thinking about the most? Where are you coming at this?
Yeah, by way of background, I served in the California State Legislature representing Silicon Valley, so homegrown technologies, of course. And for those elected officials, what is our key role? To be reminded about consumer protection and privacy. That is fundamentally the job at play. And of course, the genie oftentimes is already out of the bottle. Government, we are slow to regulate and look at the consumer protection that exists. We are oftentimes slow to catch up. And of course, representing Silicon Valley, we also want to help provide innovation, the innovation economy to thrive in homegrown in the United States and California, while also we understand that we compete with other countries as well too, and there is a competitive disadvantage. But how do we find the sweet spot in which we're focused on the consumer protection and privacy? I know there's a conversation about the future of work, displacement of workers, the role of government that plays to help look at the advancement, while also making sure that we're supporting these technologies as well. So that's, I think, the key approach, remembering consumer protection and privacy, also understanding that the industry is very competitive in the marketplace. And so while some companies may be in support, many are in opposition, and how do we all look at the foundational basic key aspects of policy and approaching it, understanding their competing interests abound.
And I'm really glad that Amanda's here. We were at this AI Safety Institute thing in the Bay Area a couple weeks ago, and I'm very grateful that Amanda decided to come. I was like, you'd be perfect for this discussion, because I do think it's going to have a profound impact, these technologies, on how we all work. Not just, is my job going away or not? That's obviously, I think, everyone's first reaction to the jobs thing. I think, I remember I was in Davos 2 years ago, right after ChatGPT had come on the scene, and it was fascinating because it had totally taken over the discussion. And it was because all these CEOs and top execs had always seen automation as something affecting their, cut costs and affecting other people's jobs. And they saw ChatGPT and they were like, well, most of what I do is write these happy emails and speeches, and this thing's really good at writing happy emails and speeches. But I think we're all trying to figure out, what does it mean for our jobs? But again, I think it's not just, is my job going away or will I have a job? But there's so much of how we work, who has power, who has protection. I don't want to steal all your thunder, Amanda. So
Steal it. This is a really good setup. First of all, thanks for having me and thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Ina. I'm Amanda Ballantyne. I run a project at the AFL-CIO, which is called the AFL-CIO Technology Institute. Many of you probably know the AFL-CIO because there's an AFL-CIO in every state and federally, but it's essentially a federation of labor unions in the United States. We represent, I think, 63 national and international labor unions that cover every sector of the economy, from sports and entertainment to manufacturing to building to service work and public employees. And the AFL-CIO launched the Tech Institute 4 or 5 years ago, really because there were so many open questions about how do new emerging digital technologies impact workers, what's the role of unions in helping workers navigate those changes. And it's really hard to predict, right? AI technologies have been in our economy for 20 years, but as AI evolves and new forms of AI emerge, there are significant impacts on how we work. What we like to say right now is that we're sort of living through a live action experiment where all these new technologies are rolling out to the marketplace, and companies and government and people are trying to figure out how to use them. But that has real human costs. It has costs for working families. It has costs for businesses that are trying to figure out how to develop their workforce and strategy. So there's a really significant role for public policymakers right now to create what we would say is like a just transition around these technologies. To regulate them effectively so they don't amplify bias and create more disparity in our economy, but also to really center workers so that workers end up in a better position as a result of this transition and not in a worse position. And that's really where we're focused. So I'm happy to be here and chat with you.
So I think some of the most interesting stuff that I hope we'll get into is on the governing piece, and how do you try and look forward as much as you can while not being reactive. But since we have the luxury of a little time, and I know a lot of people in this room are not only concerned with how they're going to govern, but how they're going to run for office and win, I wanted to start with how we expect AI to show up in campaigns. I think one of the interesting takeaways, and I give myself a tiny bit of credit because I did say, I don't think this will be remembered as the first AI election. I think it'll be remembered as the last election where AI didn't play a significant role, and I could still be wrong. But I think the takeaway from certainly 2024 was that AI was really at the margins of campaigning. There was the deepfake thing in New Hampshire. There were a couple little things, but it really, there was plenty of misinformation, but it was largely generated the same way as it had been in the last couple elections. But I want to have a bit of a broader discussion. I am curious, I want to ask the audience, and I can't see who's raising their hand, so I can just see hands, so you can admit it and be honest. I'm curious, for folks that have run in campaigns, how many, if anyone, used AI in some aspect of their campaign? I think I see a couple hands. To me, what's really interesting is right now, and I wasn't taking notes on who raised their hands, most of the commercial chatbots that are out there say explicitly you can't use this for election purposes. And again, I think they're trying to be cautious. One could certainly envision a world where you had really targeted messaging at different groups. And I think to give a flavor of what that could look like, I don't think AI was involved, but you had one of the campaigns, I believe, that basically send out diametrically opposed messages to different communities, sending folks that their databases suggest are pro-Israel, saying the other candidate's not pro-Israel, sending candidates sending voters who were potentially pro-Palestinian, the other candidate's not pro-Palestinian. AI would allow you to do that on almost any issue. I'm curious for you all, and maybe to start with you, Ryan, since I imagine, in the consulting world, there's some discussion. Where do you think AI is playing a role in elections, and where do you expect it to go?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big year for democracies around the world, not just here in the US. Over 3 billion people cast a vote in the world this year. And according to Pew, there was a survey this fall, 8 times as more Americans thought that AI would be used for nefarious purposes than good purposes. So there's clearly an expectation. I think we're all braced for impact in 2024. Nick Clegg, the global vice president for Meta, had said, we didn't see as many deep fakes and misinformation on the platform, even though there was a lot. What we're seeing right now is that the LGBT community has been particularly targeted by deep fakes and misinformation. 55% of deep fakes target LGBTQ populations versus other demographics, and 33% of political messages that have been generated. This is according to the Digital Rights Foundation. So there's clearly an eye on, at least on the back end, underneath the surface, not necessarily creating messages, but psychographic targeting of individuals, just like you're saying, to try to pit groups against each other, or really to focus on a particular, sort of weak spot in a particular issue. Brad Parscale, who ran Trump's campaign the previous cycle and in this cycle, was a consultant, has been particularly specifically focused on psychographic profiling. So there's a lot happening under the hood. That's sort of what we're seeing right now, is that there's a lot in terms of targeting that's happening versus sort of on the deep fake level. When it does come to deep fakes and misinformation, in the previous cycle, we saw a lot of national messages. This time, there was a lot of more local focus. So chatbots were focused on specific smaller communities. So you'll see a cluster of hundreds of individuals on Twitter or on Facebook talking about a particular issue. We're sharing it versus targeting thousands of people. It allows some of these AI bad actors to fly under the hood a little bit when they're pushing out misinformation.
So if I'm reading between the lines, more happened probably than we know about because it was micro?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the social media companies were braced for impact. They had built up their security and infrastructure teams. They were ready to take down accounts. And I think that, sort of the writing was on the wall, and maybe some different tactics were used by bad players.
Evan, what's been the discussion among politicians that you connect with in terms of how AI could play a role? Is it playing a role in campaigning?
Well, I think it's also just fascinating to see the hands that were raised. Many of you who have run campaigns may not know that AI, actually with machine learning, was already utilized in various facets. And so the question also then becomes, when you talk about artificial intelligence or machine learning, how is it defined and in what capacity? And the fact of the matter is, so many of our campaigns are run by utilization, I should say, of machine learning already, whether it be on data mining and voter contact and donor development, et cetera.
Yeah,
just basic communication.
I was kind of sloppy in my language too, which is fine. But I was thinking more in our discussion thus far, the newer generative type of AI versus, of course you're using it. And that is, again, as we start to, when we do move into the other part of the discussion, it does take so many forms. And we do have to be precise in our language. I'm curious, Amanda, did you see anything in this election that kind of changed your thinking of the role AI is going to play, again, before people get in office?
Well, I think from an election perspective, we represent unions that represent journalists and different media actors. We also represent unions that represent entertainment industry and celebrities. And so these unions have been focused on news quality and the ability of the public to identify disinformation and understand what information sources they can trust on the one hand. And then, our sports and entertainment unions are very concerned about deep fakes because of the way that biometric data can be used and abused and in effect sort of people's image and likeness and their intellectual property really can be stolen and repurposed without their control. So from a labor movement and a worker rights perspective, both in terms of the labor movement's approach to creating free and fair elections where voters get good quality information and education, that's a key concern. I would say while many of our unions are using predictive technologies to develop their voter profiling and their outreach strategies, there's been a pivot in the labor movement to more personal, independent contact because there's so much distrust of media and there's so much siloing online. And so, we have needed to adjust our programs and are also supporting public policies around deepfakes and the use of them in elections. On the other hand, it's a real key concern for all of you whose image and likeness could be taken and used and repurposed without your control or your ability to really stop it. Once something's on the internet, it's there forever. There's a shared interest, I think, with other public thought leaders and entertainment people who really have an interest and a stake in things like the No Deepfakes Act and other pieces of legislation that can protect people and create avenues to maintain more control over image and likeness and intellectual property. So that's, I guess, how I would respond. It's sort of both politics and also just more broadly, can the public trust the information we're getting through the media?
And on that last point around trust, that is where I expect things to get more subtle. For example, and we have seen this start to crop up, is people with one interest can spin out what appears to be a general interest news site. It appears to be a new local media outlet. And because AI is such a good aggregator, it can run, they can basically spin up an entire newsroom that's just regurgitating, pink slime is the term in the industry, regurgitating a bunch of information and then push whatever one's message is. And again, this is happening in the pre-AI era. I mean, you could argue all corporate media is essentially pushing some interest, and plenty of people feel that way about our industry. But you've seen really specific stuff. Sometimes it's overt. Chevron, for example, runs a news outlet in Richmond, California, which has plenty of local news about Richmond, but I imagine their coverage of the oil refinement industry is probably slated around a particular perspective. That's now possible at scale. I do think it's going to change the way that campaigns work. I don't expect these hard barriers around you can't use it in campaignings. It's hard to see that persisting in a world where open source capabilities are pretty high. So I want to keep the interactivity part. Last time I asked how many people used AI in their last campaign. How many people think they'll be using AI to help in their next campaign? Yeah, a lot more hands. And I would think, to me, I would think that would make sense. I think there aren't yet best practices. It's a little hard to know where that will go. But I do want to use most of our time to talk about, okay, you're in office or you're in wherever. What are some of the issues that are going to come up? And certainly one of them is regulating AI itself. And maybe that's a good place to start. And there's so many aspects to that. I mean, Amanda, you got at one of them, which is, do I own my own likeness? So much of the law is unsettled today. I mean, there are some places where existing laws actually cover the issue pretty well. So in areas where, we have, for example, protections against discrimination in employment and housing, the enforcement of it gets a lot trickier. The types of discrimination get trickier, but luckily the laws have been written broadly enough that if your hiring software is producing a discriminatory outcome, you're discriminating. It doesn't matter whether it's Bob the racist or, B period O period B the racist algorithm. If it's discriminating, and you can take legal action based on outcomes, but in a lot of areas, there aren't current protections for the most part against using your image and likeness. It's unclear, there was all this popularity with that song that sounded just like Drake. But it's not actually copyright infringement because you can only copyright something you've actually done. So if something sounds like Drake, there are other types of legislation that may play in. There's a lot of questions around the training data. There's a lot yet to be settled. Evan, maybe to start with you, what are some of the things that are coming up in terms of regulating AI? We haven't seen much at the federal level, a lot of executive orders, but we don't have something like the AI Act that Europe has proposed. I know, I don't know if she's in here, but the legislator from Colorado actually passed AI legislation, but what are you all talking about?
Well, just one in the political sphere.
Yeah, Brianna.
What was that legislation? Yeah. There's a pending legislation in Colorado now?
Yeah, Brianna, do you want to stand up? Just so people. We were in a great discussion in the Trans and Non-Binary Caucus, and one of the things I think we've seen nationally is LGBTQ leaders often have had the most success when they can show they're doing things that matter for constituents. So for Brianna in Colorado, it started with right to repair and like farm equipment. That's a huge issue across the country, and that we can lead because we're more sensitive to some of these issues, or we can be understanding the issues. We can lead and find ways to connect it to our constituents. But again, I'm curious, again, you're in the heart of Silicon Valley, so I'm sure there's also a lot of pressure from the companies who, love to say they want regulation, but every time actual regulation comes up, no, not that legislation.
That's absolutely right. I mean, just on the first front, on the political campaign components of it, oftentimes we hear from political consultants ask for forgiveness and for permission. And in the AI space, because the regulatory framework of the FEC or the Political Practices Commission in California, for example, so slow to catch up, the campaign is already done and the damage is done, so to speak. So how do we help look at some basic foundational framework on basic protections that give the authority and the teeth accordingly? As you know, you talked about LGBT leaders leading by example. As you know, Senator Scott Wiener, also from San Francisco, led with a historic piece of legislation to bring industry stakeholders to the table that ultimately did not get signed, but it sparked that conversation and talking about the startup community versus sort of the big fish, so to speak, and then also highlighted the importance, though, of the role of government to bring stakeholders to the table and try to find some commonality. While that bill, for example, Senate Bill 1047 did not pass, it sparked that conversation to say, pause now, but later we'd like to see industry come to the table. So how do we help find the commonality that exists? But we're seeing a lot with respect to protecting minors. As you may have also seen, there have been some cases in which we've seen some suicides because a young individual, a minor, was talking to artificial intelligence thinking that they were of like individuals. And so how do we look at some basic protections framework within that regard? But I also think from our community that leads to some unique challenges that exist because, as you well know, members of our community may turn to technology and they might not be in a safe space. So we find areas in which the ACLU, for example, is in direct conflict with the Trevor Project and some of our other national LGBT organizations because of the impact of members of our community trying to find out about their own identity in perhaps a home or a place to which they may not feel comfortable. So how do we find that commonality? So we are, to your point, in real time right now.
And Ryan, on the technology front, I'm curious, again, I think one of the things that people want to know is where's the technology going? And it's sometimes hard to even realize what it's here. I mean, how many people think there's a difference in technology between the glasses that Amanda's wearing and the glasses that I'm wearing? From where you're sitting, my guess is they look pretty similar. Amanda's are lovely, stylish, but not actually incorporating, to my knowledge, any specific technology. I'm wearing Meta's Ray-Bans, which I love because I play softball and they're great at taking first-person pictures. So I could take a picture of all of you. I could take a picture of this stage. But in this latest version, I can also ask an AI assistant. And what it doesn't do today, but clearly, that next step, which I'm sure a lot of the elected officials in the room might like, is, when is it going to be able to recognize and say, oh, that's the person you met? That's tempting. I'm sure a lot of folks are like, "Ooh, I could really use that," especially. But these things are also going to present a lot of challenges. And my sense is, having covered Silicon Valley for 20 plus years, I think the technology is going to come there. Like, we've seen a little bit of resistance around facial recognition just because it is so privacy intense. But I think the assumption I always make is the technology will come. It's what we as a society do. Where do you expect the technology to go? What should people in this room that are thinking about this recognize this probably around the corner?
Yeah, I mean, bystander privacy is a huge issue. When I was at Meta in-house, there were lots of teams spun up around product design and bystander privacy, trying to figure out what are the visual indicators that can show that somebody is either being filmed or videoed, or what are the parts of the processing of the data that can protect identities. So instead of saying, hey, this is you, Ina, instead it's, hey, this is a face, it's a person. There were, though, a group of researchers when this latest version of the Ray-Bans came out that were able to pull together facial recognition technology with the hardware to actually bring up names and IDs of people querying a database within 3 seconds of seeing people's faces. So, I mean, at least on the research front, that's already sort of a test case, and I assume that that will quickly come to market. It's sort of depending on what the demand here is. To see how fast that happens.
I mean, judging by the reaction in the room, I think the demand's going to be pretty high.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on the use case, right? I mean, certainly there's been a lot of success. This is the 3rd or 4th version of the product. It's a different category that Meta has been moving in versus virtual reality, which is also another area where we can sort of create relationships and imbue technology with human qualities and sort of either use it for good or nefarious purposes. But when it comes to bystander privacy, I think it's incumbent upon a lot of the leadership here in this room to also not just be afraid of the technology, but insert yourself in the conversation somewhere. Public-private partnerships we found to be really valuable because as we were building up product designs and trying to think through the different use cases, we couldn't think of all the use cases, and clearly there's a room at the table for representation in those conversations with this community.
So I want to jump in there because I think you're absolutely right about partnerships around the development of this technology and the regulation of it. There have been dozens of studies about these technologies and how they create bias or amplify bias. That's very true for facial recognition technology. It is just much more biased towards white men, white people in general, and the use of these technologies in certain contexts is high risk and should be banned. There are certain law enforcement contexts and other things. So getting really clear on what the technology can and can't do is important because the people who are selling the technology will tell you that it can do anything and everything and it's perfect. And there's a sort of inherent implicit bias that we all have. The technology is better than like a human, and that really is active in the advertisement of these technologies. I think when you're thinking about regulating the technologies, not just public-private partnerships, but also thinking about how to include other stakeholders, particularly stakeholders from communities that experience the bias of these technologies. A big project that we have at the AFL-CIO is about bringing workers and unions into these partnerships to have conversations, not just about what the technology does wrong, but about how to make it better. And then also to think about regulating it at multiple levels, like to regulate the way that existing technology impacts people now. But there's also an opportunity to use regulation and procurement strategies and other governmental tools to incentivize developers to make better technology, right? And that's a pretty important moment too, but it requires public officials and regulators to really develop a significant knowledge and to have those partnerships, not just with industry, but also with the rest of the community who's participating and being impacted by these technologies.
You brought up 2 things that I want to dive into. One, I want us to spend a bunch of time on, which is some of the bias that's inherent and our lens as members of the LGBTQ community of knowing how that bias can harm an underrepresented group or any group that's misrepresented. But the one that I want to dive into first is this idea of the use of the technology, because there's a real division among regulators of, do we regulate models based on how big they are? So should we regulate OpenAI and Anthropic and Meta because they're of a certain size, or do you regulate the use case, or both? It doesn't have to be a binary. But also, I think it's really important that the technology that's good enough in one use is really scary in another. The one that I've been talking a lot about recently is I use Otter to record almost everything that I do as a journalist, and it's really helpful for me. But I know the technology is also not good enough. If I'm actually going to use a direct quote, I have to go back and listen to the audio. And to me, it's a medium risk. Like if I screw up, there's reputational risk. But now I'm hearing that same technology is starting to be adopted to do medical transcription, where the risk of getting something wrong, life or death, police agencies using it to write up reports. And I get that doctors and police officers didn't enter their profession to spend their time writing reports, but I'm really concerned about a technology that might be good enough for one purpose getting adopted into another use case where it's dangerous. How do each of you fall on this? Should we be regulating the technology in a vacuum, based on size or by use case or both? I don't know if whoever has
in New York City, back when Uber started to really impact the taxi and limousine commission and their relationships with taxi drivers, had an approach that did not pass, and that was we as the taxi and limousine commission would need to approve every update pushed out by self-drive or share riding apps. That is probably on one end of the spectrum not the way to go. First of all, there's not enough expertise within government to sort of understand what is right, what is wrong. There's a back end, there's a front end, there's a deep set of questions that need to be answered. But when you talk about the spirit of the law, are there things that can happen, right? So making sure that surge pricing doesn't reach a certain amount, making sure there's consumer protections involved. So, there's probably a healthy medium, I think, probably regulating at the spirit level versus the actual tactical or programmatic level makes the most sense. In Europe, you mentioned the AFL-CIO Act. They have a risk-based approach. So depending, like you said, if it's something that's involved health, finance, housing, there are much deeper restrictions than something that might be more something consumer-based. And I think that that's also the right approach to think about the different categories that AI is being deployed and regulate appropriately.
Evan, you guys came so close with 1047, it passed, it just didn't get signed. It was an interesting coalition of who was in favor. It was a mix. You had some voices in tech actually supporting it, Anthropic basically saying, yeah, it's okay with us. I don't think they formally endorsed it. You had others saying no. What did you learn from that? What do you think can be taken away in terms of what might be the right approaches for AI regulation?
I just think part of the challenge is there are 120 legislators, so I should ask any elected official here. Do you run for office? Are you knocking on doors of constituents to say, I'm running for a state legislature or Congress because I want to regulate AI? The answer for the vast majority, did anyone say that? No. Oh, one person?
Colorado.
Oh, Colorado.
That's our friend from Colorado.
Well, for the vast majority of people, it's not a key core competency. That is not going to be compelling enough to win that of a voter. They maybe care about water, public safety, climate change, affordable housing, etc. So you really have individuals who do not necessarily come from the area of subject matter expertise. And so you rely on the staff, if there are staff members or industry. And so I think that's where the difficulty exists. In fact, in the state of California, we are grappling with this issue right now of the future of work. So Waymo, if any of you have been in an autonomous vehicle, please try it out and see what it looks like. But at the same time, we also know that this is the elephant in the room is the displacement of workers. And when you have Teamsters and truck drivers, how do we make sure that we have the just transition and making sure that we support our workers, but support our innovation economy? What does the regulatory framework look like? Meanwhile, as we are handicapped by that, those two key values, supporting the innovation economy and also being pro-worker, we know that other states are rolling out the red carpet on the regulatory framework and saying, we'll write the regulations however you see fit. These are red states. I don't think that's the approach to go, but we also will hear from executives saying, we want to be in California, we don't want to go to these other states, but we will pack our bags and leave if not. And so how do we find that commonality in bringing labor to the table to find a win-win solution that supports these technologies?
And the way you framed it, again, is sort of also the question, like if you say, how many of you, if you go door to door, it's probably not a winning argument to say, I'm going to regulate AI, except for perhaps Brianna. But I think when you say, I'm concerned with, how algorithms are going to decide jobs and healthcare, I think there is a sense, and I don't think this is misplaced, that AI is going to affect all those things. It really is. I mean, insurers are using algorithms to decide what care gets approved and not. And to be honest, they were rejecting legitimate claims before AI. I think what's unique about this moment, though, is the industry is nascent enough that we can look at how it's performing. One of the things that I worry about is, one of the things generative AI is best at is convincing sounding bullshit and hiding, it's using billions of parameters to make a decision. So it's very hard to pinpoint why it decided what it did. So in some things, we can legislate or adjudicate outcomes. But I do worry that as the technology gets better, it's going to be harder actually to pick out the discrimination. So it does feel to me that the time is right, and to look at what protections do we want in healthcare, in hiring, et cetera. Amanda, I'm curious, in some of your work, is how algorithms are used across the worker experience. What are some of the issues that you're looking at?
Yeah, so, and also to jump back to your initial question, do we regulate the size of the models or do we regulate the use cases? I think it's really, when I think of like AI and AI regulation in the last 2 or 3 years, I see in my mind one of those images of like the tsunami going over Japan, right? There's just so much, there's so much use coming. There are millions and millions of use cases, each with their own particular challenges and opportunities. And I think we have a really significant power differential, not just in terms of the concentration of the big tech industry, but also a big knowledge gap between how informed big tech is and how organized they are around how they want the actual language written, and then the rest of us who are just learning maybe what algorithms are, I think sometimes in the labor movement. And so when we're talking about that power disparity, it's not just capital concentration, it's also a big knowledge gap. And this is where your concerns really amplify for me, because it feels very much, for those of us who are working in regulation, that there's like maybe an 18-month or 3-year window to get those public interest protections that we need in place to prevent the types of bias and to get this industry set up in a way that is fair. In the labor movement, there's certainly a concern about algorithmic management, which is very active in the platform economy, but also, people think of algorithmic management where you have an app that is hiring, determining your working conditions, and determining, firing potentially. People think of that in Amazon warehouses. They think of that with Uber and Lyft. They don't think of that like for administrative law judges or nurses or teachers. But that technology is very much at play in other types of professions, and professions where we don't even suspect it's going on. So when we think about fairness, and how really workers can not only have a say, but also participate in the benefits of these technologies, there needs to be a lot of education, and there needs to be a very clear focus on enforcement. Right now, we live in a society where workers can't really enforce their rights, or in very few states can workers actually, like a regular person, enforce their rights, because there's not a lot of investment in enforcement. The only way to create a good balance as we regulate the tech industry around AI issues is to really lean in on enforcement and liability issues, and to make it easy for people to have transparency so they understand when there are these technologies operating, what these technologies are doing, who has access to the information that they're collecting, to have a right to contest what information might be there, and then to have real avenues to seek redress. Part of the theory is like, where is the human in the loop in decision making? That is something that needs to be regulated industry by industry, so that when people are having insurance claims denied, or they're having disparate impacts on mortgage applications, there's an easy way for regular people to get that looked at and solved. Right now, that doesn't exist anywhere. The same is true in work, I guess I would say. I think we're in a situation where employers are using off-the-shelf technologies, and the employers themselves don't even understand what these technologies are doing. And so that liability chain, we really have to look at what is incentivizing tech companies to produce better tech, and to really pay attention to the law and how the technology is operating.
And I want to dive into two things that were, I think, under the surface of what you were saying, and that is that a lot of this is rather subtle and it's not always intended, but that doesn't mean it's not real. So for example, a lot of what these generative AI models are good at is pattern matching. So if you ask them, who's going to be good at a job, it's very likely that some of the factors of what's going to predict success are the things that have the inequities in society. So if you ask who's going to be more likely to reoffend among criminals, it's going to be biased because the white-collar criminal who had a family and a support system before they were incarcerated is less likely to reoffend, but that's not because they're better inherently, whatever. Similarly, on the flip side, on the worker side, if you're using a hiring algorithm, unless you really do the work to notice the bias, to find it, a lot of what a pattern matching recognition will do is find things that are proxies for all the factors that we don't want to discriminate. Is there a way to think about the unintended or ignored consequences and get ahead of some of those things? Because again, I do feel like we have this fairly narrow window. How are we doing there? Yeah, I agree.
I mean, this is again where the stakeholder conversation really matters. Public-private partnerships where government is really in conversation with companies about what they're building, but also bringing in the stakeholders who are impacted. Because we say in the labor movement, and I would say this is true broadly for your constituency base, workers are experts in technology. They know what makes their jobs safer or less safe. They know what makes their job easier or harder. And they know what makes their jobs fairer or less fair. And so you have to really understand that workers in the employment context bring a ton of knowledge to the table that management doesn't have on how technologies work. They're the ones who are troubleshooting broken technology every day. These technologies are not designed by workers, right? They're designed by engineers in partnership with managers and purchasing agents and others. So there is really a lot of value in having honest conversations and fostering those conversations between industry and labor or between industry and civil rights communities. Because I do think that there's a shared interest in having this all go well for everyone, right? And so now I think is the time to really draw on your community's expertise.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because Meta and some of the companies you've worked at did do some work to bring in outside groups, especially around some of these really sensitive areas. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what's happening enough and what isn't?
Yeah, I mean, it was very, very rare when someone would either come to us or we would ask for public-private partnerships in underrepresented communities for the conversation to not happen, for us to not move the ball forward. So I would say the power of convening and just having a passion for the category is enough to start. Either reaching out to companies or reaching out to experts in your local community or within your district, super helpful. That's generally one of the places that the companies don't know where to start. Sometimes they're either going to very high level where there's a lot of competing interests from elected officials who have their time divided. But sometimes when you look below the hood into more local, sort of jurisdictions, it's easier to create a relationship with some of these communities. So the power of convening has been incredibly helpful.
And how open are the companies in general? And if you want to give specifics, feel free. But feel free to also, just kind of talk about what you've seen. Because my sense is, they talk a good game, but they're not always, I think it's a mix.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the business unit within a company, right? So there's leadership, which are generally sort of connected with sort of, the top line financial considerations or the strategic direction. But product teams are very interested in trying to make the product appeal to as many people as possible, right? They want market share. And so that means deeply understanding edge cases, people that are on the sort of the edge of the quartiles, where you're sort of thinking through, how do we model behavior? How do we understand what these users need? So I think the product teams especially are very, very interested, engineering teams. Unfortunately for them, sometimes they don't know where to look. So the power of convening and raising hands goes a very, very long way.
And they're not representative. I mean, we know, Evan, because it's the demographics of some of your district, all of us know, the tech industry is not very representative.
No.
So they come from a place of limited perspectives and a tendency towards bias. And to your point, it kind of happens based on a particular product group or whatever. I thought it was interesting that you suggested that people reach out, because I don't think that's generally something that occurs to people is, hey, tell the tech company you're interested. And I think that applies to elected officials too.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said about just showing an interest in the area. You do not have to be an expert in AI in order to get real traction in the category.
Yeah, that was one of the things. I'm trying to think. One of the women who's very prominent in the field was encouraging people. Oh, it was Helen Toner, the former OpenAI board member. One of her big points post OpenAI is, to get involved and not assume you don't have a voice in this. And I want to talk about the unique voice that LGBTQ people, including elected officials, can play, because we are sensitive to bias. And we also are sensitive to the fact that, as you point out, sometimes the technology legislation gets pitched as, oh, we're going to protect children. I think, everyone wants to protect children, but we also know that technology has been a safe space. How do each of you think that our unique perspectives, again, not that there's one LGBTQ perspective, but what are some of the things we can bring from our experience to help elevate that discussion, to help make sure that we're considering not just the general impact, but the disproportionate impact of some of these technologies and legislation?
Excuse me. There was a piece of legislation that passed in the state of California that required parental consent for minors on social media platforms. Again, as I mentioned the group earlier, it then put the ACLU and Trevor Project against some of the consumer protection groups as well too, and it left us in a position. Republicans utilized that to say, look, the LGBT community does not want to protect your children. And that was a very challenging political environment for us, understanding that we have members of our community that want to feel safe. And so where do we find that opportunity? But to the points that was made earlier about the convening, and at least to understand our perspective, I think is very meaningful as well too. But again, for the elected officials, the leverage that we have is the introduction of a bill. Oftentimes, stakeholders will not come to the table unless there is a moving piece of legislation. And oftentimes, it's been my experience representing Silicon Valley that member companies will try to undercut each other because they're fiercely competitive in the marketplace. They'll hide behind trade associations, and they'll individually come to you. Ultimately, we are the legislature, so we need to make the determination accordingly, even though industry may be opposed. But again, it's been my experience such that you talk to the government affairs person or the engineer that they bring to you in the Capitol, but then something gets lost in translation as it gets to legal all the way up in these companies. Member companies can't actually take official positions, or they're hesitant to. And so it leaves to ultimately that we as the electeds need to make the ultimate decision.
And I do think it is an opportunity for state and local officials to make a mark, as Brianna has in Colorado, because, as you point out, we've had federal legislation on the table on privacy, on all these things. Very little federal legislation passes, very little controversial legislation passes these days. So what that's left is it allows a state that comes in with a significant law to become the de facto standard. So if there's a piece of AI, it doesn't have to be, some giant legislation, but it might be one piece. It might be, Amanda raised the issue of owning your own likeness. There is a bill before Congress, I believe, that would protect it, but I also think a state might be able to do it, or, we've even seen, obviously it was at the center of the actors and the writers' unions, and all these writing was getting those protections. Sometimes it's not legislation, it's organizing that comes in and at least shows what's possible.
Yep.
How do you get from, Tom Hanks has protection to an average worker has some protection that a company won't take everything that makes them good at their job and put it into an algorithm and say, great, thanks for training our algorithm. We're good, see ya.
Well, for this reason, and I think we would say over the past couple of years, we've seen it really broadcast, collective bargaining is a fabulous tool for regulating these types of technologies. And the reason for that is there's so many different use cases, and every employer has a different sort of suite of technology that they're using. So what collective bargaining offers is a kind of bespoke solution where workers get together and talk about it and then are in a labor management conversation. I think you saw with the writers, with the screen actors, with the Teamsters, the longshoremen are still working on it. But in industry after industry, what you're seeing is these sort of like proto regulations around how workers want to be engaged in this question of technology. What's so interesting to me about the writers who had the first major strike over AI is that they didn't say, hey, we don't want this technology in our industry at all. They said, we want to control how it's used and how we use it in our own work. You could imagine a scenario where generative AI just sort of replaces the creative aspects of a screenwriter's job, and then a screenwriter sort of becomes an editor. And same for journalism, same for other creative professions. And what you saw was these screenwriters saying, hey, we want to use this technology, but we want to figure out what it's good for and what it's not good for. We don't want you to give it human screen credits so that it can make money. They put guardrails on it so that they could use it. And I think that if you engage with workers and communities, you'll not only see that through collective bargaining agreements, but also through what they would bring to table in a negotiation around public policy issues.
How important is it that all of us, and this is a leading question, I guess I'm putting my foot on the scale, but how important is it to use the technology, to experiment with it? Ryan, what do you think the difference between trying to approach how you use the technology or how you regulate it without deep experience versus getting some of that firsthand experience?
It's crazy to think that ChatGPT's only been around for 2 years and it has such deep penetration. So the reason I bring that up is because most of us are not experts, and that's okay. I think there's a lot of sometimes fear or anxiety around, I don't know where to start. And the important part is to start. I consult my clients to actually lean on people who are newer to their organization and younger in their organization, who might be more digital natives or have a facility with technology, to show them how the technology could be sort of integrated or experimented with in their business. So just starting is incredibly important. Also, sort of digital hygiene. We talked a little bit about privacy and education and transparency, but there's a bit of a delta between sometimes the attitudes around privacy and attitudes around AI and transparency, and then behaviors. So for instance, at Meta, we found that even though we have privacy tools available, less than 5% of people globally ever touch them. So there's a couple of resources that you could keep in touch with to sort of educate yourself and your constituents. One is the Algorithmic Justice League, headed by MIT Dr. Joy Buolamwini. Fantastic organization, really focusing on the rights of underrepresented people when it comes to AI. Another is Privacy Party. It's a technology group that is focused on how you protect your privacy online in your digital trail. So it's both, how you proactively use it, but then also defensively how you might, protect yourself and safeguard your data so that models aren't ingesting it willy-nilly and you're protecting yourself.
And I'm curious because, I remember when all the social media leaders got hauled before Congress, and it was a real reminder, in case you couldn't tell, how much older and less tech savvy the highest echelons of federal government are. What level of expertise are you seeing? What level of interest from your colleagues in actually using and understanding the technology, so we don't have the equivalent of, basically you're trying to regulate the frontier and somebody's asking, how do I fix my printer, which I believe was part of the last round of hearings.
Oh, yes. So many of us watched and just gasped to see the lack of competency from members who are regulating. Again, it's not a key core competency if it might be from the area. And so who do they rely on to help advance some of these issues? And so it then becomes the issues of convening, but then also the role that we play. What are our values, and what is the role of government as a legislator, understanding that that is our key role and how they make sure that these things thrive. You all know that TikTok is scheduled to be banned in the United States, even though the everyday consumer has already advanced. And so how do we find that the disconnect that exists, and what is the role that we play? But I think, again, our experience has been such that in the venture capital world and in the startup community, they're so focused in the R&D and focused on the technology that they tend to forget about the regulatory framework until it gets to that point. By then, the technology has already advanced and we're slow to catch up. So how do we help make sure that we have individuals with a sense of competency from a generational perspective, but also utilization, and making sure that we are putting the foundation, introducing legislation to bring stakeholders to the table, and then ultimately going from there. But absent that of having any type of leverage of legislation, again, my experience is that we don't want to allow tech companies to write regulations accordingly, but that's our fundamental role. So that's kind of the importance. And of course, members of our community, whether it be Mr. Altman or Mr. Cook, as technology leaders, also understand the lens that exists as well too. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see, especially over the next 4 years, the importance of representation from our community and technology as well.
And Amanda, you kind of got at this with, some of the examples you gave of workers can be the experts in how AI is going to affect their field. How important is it if you're in a field to be expert or at least understand how AI is potentially impacting your job so you can be a voice for what you want, again, whether that's as part of a union, as a constituent, or as an elected official and leader?
Again, I think using these technologies, understanding how they're impacting your work, the compensation of people in certain industries, the decision-making and discretion that people have in their jobs, particularly, I would say, the healthcare setting is the most sort of obvious, but education and, other significant fields that have significant public impact. So I would say not only understanding the technology as it relates to you, everybody in this room works, right? And so what technology, we were all talking about, should we all have glasses like Ina's? But I think more broadly, there's a real question about where humans fit in the tech stack in some of these technologies. And for public officials who are looking at healthcare impacts, housing impacts, sort of economic disparities, there are visible trends now. And getting really savvy on understanding what those are can help you ask the right questions when you're thinking about how to bring in the right people to move policy to regulate these technologies. So I would say leaning in, but you don't have to be a technical expert, I guess is what I would say, right? You don't have to know how an algorithm functions to have an opinion on how it should be regulated. So I say be brave and get in there.
And one of the nice things about this technology is, unlike other tech waves, which really started, you had to have a lot of expertise and then it slowly got made easier. ChatGPT's been around for 2 years. It's as consumer friendly in some ways as a major technology shift has been. And I also think you bring up another point, which is in terms of understanding how it's impacting, not just you. I think it's an opportunity for a lot of the local and state officials in the room, understand how it's affecting your constituents. Like, it's not always about having a bill, but it's understanding what are your constituents worried about? If there's a big industry, if you're, a company town, if you're an industry town, chances are that is an issue. Again, you're not going to win it by knocking on the door saying, I'm here to regulate AI, but you might well get a lot of support if, let's say you're a military town and you're really concerned with how the military is using AI. What are some of the opportunities? Oops, sorry, my audiobook just started playing. What are some of the opportunities to lead? Like, where can this be an opportunity for folks in the room to take, fear and concern, which is a motivator, it gets people talking, and become the expert? Certainly Brianna is someone to talk to about that, but what are some of the other ways you can use an understanding of AI to lead?
Well, to the point of the future of work, this is what we're grappling with in California right now, which is we want to get off, in California, getting off the reliance on fossil fuels. So in Richmond, when you have the Chevron and the refinery, these are union workers, predominantly brown and black communities, majority funding the city budget and revenues. But when we talk about the elimination and getting off the reliance of fossil fuels as a bill that we passed in 2045 to get a fossil fuel electric grid by 2045, what does that look like and how do we make sure those stakeholders are at the table? Electrical workers, IBEW, versus that of the solar industry. Understand the solar industry is not unionized, but you have electrical workers that are in the traditional utilities, that of Teamsters versus that of the Waymos and truck drivers, that of United Food and Commercial workers that are concerned about the self-checkouts and what does that look like for the future of their membership. So again, the role of government and how do we understand and recognize the important roles that we play about acknowledging the future work, the importance of the values and supporting workers alike, and how do we look at a regulatory framework that is pro-technology and also pro-worker at the same time. Oftentimes when, in my experience, an executive or a company thinks about or hears about unionization, they get concerned because they have seen certain aspects, but there are other best practices of good corporate union employers that I think we should emulate as best practices as well.
We've talked a lot about AI as if it's coming from one place, and a lot of it does come from Evan's district. But one of the aspects that I've seen a lot of, and again, this is on the national level especially, but I think it's going to filter down, is pitting this as a race between US and China. And that becomes a boogeyman for what I hear a lot from the tech companies is, well, you know, if we don't do it, China is national security or competitiveness as a, if you regulate us, China will win, and sort of this boogeyman. How, you know, particularly as we enter a new era again in DC, I'm curious, you know, how prevalent do you hear that argument, and what techniques are useful to say, yes, I care about competitiveness, and yes, I care about national security, and you know, we still need to have protections.
It's a very real and present conversation right now. Generally speaking, when it comes to sort of national security and our competition with China on AI, you could think about the race in three areas when it comes to AI. Algorithms, these are labs that are building out foundational models like OpenAI. There's compute, which is powered by hardware like NVIDIA. And then there's data, which is like Scale AI, Palantir. And in each three of those categories, the US has varying degrees of a lead. Where we do not have a lead is in the fourth category, powering all of this. China has built an entire US worth of power over the past 5 to 7 years, and we are woefully behind. And you mentioned earlier the power of procurement. So I do think about maybe the unsexy part of using the power of the purse and incubating at the local level to really understand how to give American companies a competitive edge. It is, unfortunately, a fulcrum, a boogeyman in conversations when it comes to regulation, but there's also a very, very real competitive national security and infrastructure consideration too. And so I do think the power of procurement and how these conversations, how we get public-private partnerships to happen are critically important.
I would also say, I think, you know, when we talk about global competition, that creates challenges and opportunities, right? And I think that when you look at the sort of AI tech stack, there are a lot of opportunities not only to create good local jobs. I mean, that's what we saw in the Chips and Science Act around the sort of efforts to kind of home grow a new leading edge semiconductor industry. The labor movement has been involved in that. And we would argue that those will be good jobs to the extent that they're union jobs. But I think also the IRA and the IIJA, like those are bills that are put in place to really change infrastructure in the United States. And you have to think of that both as an effort to manage clean energy, but also to make our tech economy more competitive. Those types of legislation, some aspects of those will be continued by this new federal administration, but a lot now is up to the states. And so when you think about transition strategies and how these technologies are impacting people, also understand that there's a much longer trail of public investment into these technologies. And at every aspect of that innovation chain or that tech stack, you have an opportunity to make this technology work better for working people. And I think it's public-private partnerships, but also not being afraid to ask about job quality standards, not being afraid to ask companies what they're planning on doing for the community, and making sure that it's more than just investing in a local t-ball team, right? These could be very exploitive industries if we don't hold them accountable, but they could also be industries that really produce, for all of us, shared prosperity.
And one of the things you mentioned in those 4 categories is data. And data is what's fueling, it's what is allowing a lot of these algorithms. But I also think a lot about data collection as we're entering a new administration that could weaponize some of that data that's being collected. And I think particularly about the LGBTQ community, things that might have a purpose, like being really careful about what data you have. And I've seen that come up. Certainly California called a special session to think about how to protect immigrants, LGBTQ people, and others that might be targeted. A lot of times the assumption is, oh, the more data we have, the better. We make better decisions. But if you're collecting data on gender and you want to see how many trans people you're serving, you might also be creating a list of trans people to be subpoenaed. If you are asking, if you're a nonprofit and you want to know people's documentation status so that you know who you're serving, you might, if you don't do it in the right way, you might be collecting data that would be used against the people you're serving. How should we be thinking about data heading into an administration that we know is probably going to, they have openly said they're looking for mass deportations, they're looking to remove protections for LGBTQ people. I know it's not quite AI, but I feel like it's quite AI adjacent, and AI will help, could be used to aid their job based. If that data exists, AI makes it easier to take action, I guess is the way to say it.
The bad news is the cat's out of the bag on that front. A lot of personal data that we have, because our approach generally over the past 2 decades when it's come to social media is the public sphere. And then AI models have then ingested that data with or without permission in order to build foundational models. Moving forward, like I said, there are organizations that are starting to pop up to help educate users on how to protect their data, how to use tools that are available. I don't see a lot of conversation around how to sort of reverse engineer locking down data. It will be a competitive advantage, and I know this is more about the future of artificial intelligence, but there's quantum as a computational category where a lot of cryptography innovation is happening in order to lock down data. Thinking about sort of the power of blockchain or W3, World Wide Web 3, right? How to sort of give micro or fine-tune controls to privacy when it comes to data, so that you might have access to the data, but I'm not going to let another person or another organization have access to that same data set. Still a very novel and nascent category. Obviously, the more consumers and the more demand there is, the more calls for action around this category, the faster it will move. But we've been so focused on the productization side that we haven't really taken a look at infrastructure and guts and had wide-scale, mature conversations about the data pipeline.
How much, Evan, has the data conversation been happening in terms of trying to protect against these very important goals of protecting constituents?
As you know, we led in the nation with the Consumer Privacy Act on the right to opt out and to collect data and the right to know. But ultimately, to be weaponized, that's a significant concern. And so there's no substitute to making sure that we are at the table and making these policies. That's why please run for office and making sure that we have representation all across in the states, especially in the next 4 years, that state houses are that much more important.
And there's also an individual level aspect. You mentioned opting out in California. We've been doing a series at Axios where we're going company by company, because what's fascinating is basically most of these large foundational models, with a few notable exceptions, were trained using all the information they could find on the internet, whether they had rights to it or not. They're not saying what's in there, but my assumption is just about everything. The one sliver where they have to say what they're doing is their own customers' data. So we were like, well, if that's the one sliver that we know, let's at least publicize that. So we're doing this series going company by company and saying, here's what the data. So Meta is like, if you post publicly on Instagram or it's a Facebook post marked public, it's training our algorithms. You can't opt out unless you're in Brazil or the EU, all the way to other companies. Apple, for example, is saying, we are going to use your personal information for you, but we're going to design it in a way that even we can't make use of that data. And again, some of it is what you collect and not, but are there opportunities to come in and say, for example, like California's original privacy law, and again, that's what is allowing us to write this series, is the fact that under California law and other states, you actually do have to say, what data are you collecting and how are you using it? Is there a next step that would help?
Well, just even to pause on just what the reference of the Privacy Act, as you well know, industry did not come forth tripping over themselves to say we're going to support this measure. In fact, they said this is going to be doomsday. And in fact, that has not been realized. And so there lies the effort to which there was a legislative proposal. An individual put it on the ballot, given the direct democracy that anyone could put a proposition on the ballot, and that's the formation. And so how do you build off of that, and understanding that we do need to focus on some basic fundamentals and that industries will comply accordingly. But again, what is the role that we play in making sure that we're advancing many of these different issues, absent that of any type of congressional engagement? So I think that's why state houses are that much more important now.
Amanda, does at the business level, I mean, mostly you're talking about worker protections and protecting the jobs within that company. Do workers and at individual companies have a role to play in what data their companies are collecting? You know, we've seen this, particularly when that data or how the technology is being used. We've seen that come up. You know, certainly Google, the workers have had a large voice of saying we're not okay with this, that, you know, often it's the military use or police use of the technology. What role do workers have, particularly within the tech field, but wherever they are, in terms of their business conduct? And this has been an issue. That Alphabet Workers Union is sort of this different kind of union. They don't represent the company for bargaining purposes, but they've become this consolidated voice. And one of the things that traditional labor union really can't weigh in on how the products are being used. They are at least giving voice to how it's being used. What role do workers play in this?
Well, I think in some ways workers really are a bulwark because they understand how the technologies work and often can explain those uses and potential use cases to the public in ways that, you know, their parent corporations may not. It's complicated, right? Because I think, first of all, workers' rights in this country, while we have good worker rights laws, they're not enforced very well. So the right to form and join a union, for example, it is incredibly difficult to organize a labor union in the private sector in the United States. Companies routinely fire workers who are trying to organize because it's almost a cost-benefit analysis. You know, the penalties for breaking the law and firing organizing employees are so minimal. So it takes a lot of bravery to do what workers in the tech industry are doing. We do have laws that protect concerted activities where workers come together to talk about their wages, hours, and working conditions. But I think that more broadly, you know, on some of these technologies, they're so complicated that you have to, in some ways, like really understand how the technology works to be that first line of translation to the public. And so I think, first of all, we should all be really grateful for folks in the tech industry who are standing up and doing that, explaining, because it helps all of us. But I think really leaning in to protect those workers by giving them cover, by doing sort of whistleblower legislation, and by leaning in on companies that are violating workers' rights by breaking unionization efforts.
There's so much data within corporations themselves that workers, you know, can really represent their own rights within. It's not just social media data or data that's in the public domain. So, for instance, ChatGPT, OpenAI trained their latest model on give or take a petabyte of data, all the data available on the public web. JP Morgan Chase, just as one organization, has 14 petabytes worth of data. So the real sort of like data opportunity that has been untapped so far, but where there's a real opportunity to get ahead of the conversation, is still trapped or still locked within companies. So the ability for workers to help take a role and say in what happens to that data is important.
So we're getting to this point. We've got a little under 15 minutes left. What haven't we been talking enough about? What are the things that you want the folks in this room to know about where we're headed with AI? What haven't we talked about?
Well, one of the things that I would say is that there's just, especially at the state and local level, there's going to be an unbelievable amount of legislation coming your way and regulatory efforts on these technologies. And I think that, at least from a labor perspective, some of that will be broad sort of civil rights protections or worker rights protections, but a lot of it will be very industry focused. And I think that can be overwhelming, but the decisions that are made industry by industry will have enormous impacts on workers and on consumers who are experiencing it. And so I guess, I've sort of been beating this drum consistently the whole time, but really thinking about how you can use your convening power, your ability to create study bills, your ability to get your governors to pull together commissions to study things, and making sure, not that there's just like one or two civil society people on those commissions or in those studies, but that there is fair representation. If you've got 15 people from industry, you should have 15 people from labor and community organizations. There should be efforts to sort of equalize the education that's going to those people so there's not a huge deficit at the beginning where big tech can kind of set the agenda in those conversations. But there should be work to bring people along so that they can have an equal voice. That is going to be really critical. The labor movement has a lot of resources. And so if you want to connect with your local AFL-CIO or labor unions in your community, we would love to help you make those connections and to bring them into conversation with you, because unions have a ton of technical expertise on how different technologies have shaped and impacted their industries over time, and they can be fantastic partners. I would say the same thing for the civil rights and privacy organizations in your community. So don't hesitate to not only do that convening, but to bring in civil society partners in a serious way.
Other things that we haven't gotten to, and then I want to get to what we should take away and how we move forward, but other things that you would throw into the pot?
The other thing, just to add to that, it's just a values-based approach. What is the role that we play? Am I going to write however technology, the technologists feel that should be written, or who am I protecting? What issues are we trying to solve? But the power convening is important, and ultimately, tech may not be on the same page, labor might not be on the same page, but at least they will acknowledge the genuine intent of convening and ultimately doing our job, that of legislating. I think that's also things only elected officials can understand, that which you say, I've tried my best, not everyone's on the same page, they're all disagreeing, but ultimately I need to make that determination, and how do I become that subject matter expert to my colleague to say that I've helped to engage with this, because the political environment then will be that labor will be opposed, so are you anti-labor, and or business may be opposed, and the Chamber of Commerce may say, well, you're anti-business. Ultimately, though, you know that you put the investment in making sure that your power of convening from a values-based approach. It has been my experience.
We're constantly playing catch up if we're just sort of coming to the conversation around AI writ large. There's a couple of AI adjacent categories I would love to see more people tap into. We've talked about sort of agentic AI or reasoning models that you can type with. That's on the software side. But add a piece of hardware to AI, and now it's robotics and affecting blue-collar jobs, not just white-collar jobs. And so this idea of universal basic income that has sort of been piloted in some European countries, dabbled with here on stateside, I'd like to see a bigger conversation there because of the economic impact that both software side and hardware side AI takes. And then a little bit further out there, doesn't sound crazy, Elon Musk already has a company called Neuralink. It's about integrating computers with brains. They have sort of gold threads that attach to neurons, that integrate software. That's something that AI will be incredibly powerful around in terms of understanding the brain, how we integrate sort of the safety precautions, the regulatory issues. Those conversations will be fast upon us, both on the robotic side and on human-computer interfaces. And that's why I would love to see more people get involved with those two categories.
So I hope we're already starting to give you a bunch of things that each of you can see, oh, here's an opportunity given my expertise, given my constituency. But with the last few minutes, what are some action items. And maybe, Ryan, to start with, what are some things people can take away? If your client was a elected official in a region, what would some of your advice be? What's some free advice you can give?
Yeah, the power of convening, again, is incredibly powerful. Sometimes when I'm talking to clients, again, it's their own anxiety or apprehension about I don't know where to start that paralyzes them to not start. You have an incredible power of convening as an elected official to bring together people in academia, bring people together in the private sector and the public sector, and advocates as well. Also education. These companies, again, that are using data do have some privacy policies attached to them, not doing a great job of communicating that with the general public. How can you as an elected official also help educate the public in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of digital hygiene? It's certainly a role that you can take, and it's not just an AI window that you could take it through. It's through the window of economic security, public health, individual aptitude, and the like.
I'm curious, kind of, again, you've been through a bunch of exercises over the years of regulating technology. Sometimes it passes, sometimes it doesn't. I'm curious, my suspicion is that a lot of folks in the room care about this issue, but it's not necessarily come up in the same way it has in California for a vote as part of bills. What are some lessons for state and local officials who want to be ahead of the curve, but don't have as much legislation brewing as you have in California or Brianna in Colorado has done?
I think just when we legislators have introduced legislation, industry traditionally has been in opposition because we'd rather just innovate. We're more libertarian, let us innovate, and we know what is best. But ultimately, the sky's not fallen, and we make sure that we're focused on these basic protections that exist. But it is important, again, the value-based approach. And that often puts us at odds with other key allies. I talked about the just transition and fossil fuel industry, and the environmental justice community plus that of organized labor. How do we find the commonality? Or Waymo versus that of Teamsters? That is where the difficulty lies, and we may not be able to iron out those issues in a committee process. And so the power of convening vis-a-vis a tech caucus or other opportunities, I think, are very important. So open invitation. If anyone wants to have any conversations with anyone in Silicon Valley, please welcome to see me. I'm happy to make any introductions to provide any subject matter expertise. And what are some other best practices in other states? California doesn't always get it right, and there might be some better model legislation in Colorado and other places as well.
And any state, or I think it's more at the state level than the local level, but one of the things we've seen is that any state with a significant population, oftentimes if they pass a bill, the companies would rather comply with it, once they get it watered down to their appropriate level or not. They'd rather comply nationally or globally than have a separate policy. I think, Illinois has a facial recognition law, for example, that's become a de facto standard because you're not going to create a separate product for Chicago. It seems to me that one of the takeaways, too, is, don't legislate beyond your expertise, but also don't assume you don't have a role to play. I think I had enough negatives in there. That was 3. Assume you have a role to play. I think that would be simpler.
I mean, as you well know, members of Congress have looked at the California Privacy Act as model proposals and the preemption or not, but it still pushes the leverage point of saying, well, we have something foundationally to work on. So know your own influence and know your own voice and your power.
So maybe with the last few minutes, you brought up a few things in terms of where the technology is going, and I think it might be useful to have a little bit of a discussion so you all know what's coming. I mean, we've been talking a lot about AI as it exists today, which is ChatGPT. It's chatbots where one person sitting at a computer asks a question, but that's not the only place that the technology is going. I want to just throw out some of the possibilities. We don't have to solve them all, but you talked about 2 that I think are worth bringing up. Agentic, meaning, how many people know what we're talking about when we say agentic AI? You're not alone, don't worry. But that is one of the things that's coming next, which is the computer can do something on its own. So instead of me having to ask a question, and that can be really simple, it can show up on my phone, bring up your boarding pass because it knows you're going to the airport. That's a pretty simple thing that exists today, but it can be a lot further. Yeah. Talk about both where it's going in agentics, and then what does it mean when we, put hands on an AI system in the robotics case?
Yeah, the agentic example that most people have used right now is ordering a ticket for travel, where an agentic AI is not just talking with you, it's not just words that are being exchanged, but it's actions that are being exchanged. So it knows how much money you have in your bank account, it knows your preferences in terms of flying, aisle, window, route, how many tickets, and it can provide you essentially with the all of the steps up until the endpoint in which you click purchase, and that's agentic. You could think of it as like an executable AI that takes actions on your behalf. That's going to first start with software systems that we have a lot of understanding of how workers use software. Agentic AI also moves from one environment to the next. We as humans are really good at taking a piece of information from software and transferring it into another system and then transferring it into another system in order to complete a set of actions. AI within this next 6 months to a year will be starting to do that in areas again where we use software, so finance, law, a lot of the back office scenarios. A lot of displacement. The agentic AI world that we're going to be in is also going to be pushed by a lot of the major tech players who are coming out with their models as well. How are you able to, within your own offices, able to potentially do that? The jury is still out. There's not a lot of use cases when it comes to communications. Customer service is an area that has been used a lot for agentic
Constituent
AI.
mail sounds like an area that will probably be heavily impacted. How many folks in the room would like to use AI to help better communicate with constituents? Okay. Other takeaways, last bits of it, either advice on where things are going or what
well, I think at the state level, you're going to see also a lot of efforts, to automate sort of big sections of government. This is certainly going to be happening at the federal level. And so there's going to be a lot of conversation about procurement. And, I think you can see in states already there being conversations about automating unemployment systems or kind of health and welfare benefit systems. I think it's really important to think about the public interest aspects of your procurement standards. And I think that, again, like ensuring that workers and benefits recipients are involved in those conversations, because those systems are very clunky. Right, and so there can also be political blowback if a system doesn't work well, and it takes a long time for a system to work out its kinks. So I would say, it's not sort of sexy leading edge like agentic AI, but the procurement and the implementation of these systems in government is a huge area that you should be focused on to make sure it goes well.
Well, we've hit the point where we're out of time, but I hope this discussion's been useful. If you do want to know more about AI, shameless self-plug, I do a free daily newsletter for Axios. You can just go to aiplus.axios.com. I'll be in your inbox every day. Whether that's a good thing or not, you can decide. But I really want to thank the panel for what I hope was a fairly enlightening and wide-ranging talk on where we're going. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to our incredible panelists.